So my name is Kellee Wicker, and I direct the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center, which is a congressionally mandated think tank. Our primary audience are always policymakers. So what I spend a lot of my time doing is translating the work of the technologists and engineers into plain English. So let's talk about the state of play right now of US AI regulation. And thankfully, Ori kind of covered some of the international things that we've seen, so we can focus. Some important background to start with. Congress fundamentally doesn't know technology, and this is a problem. It makes it hard to have these conversations because the language that we speak in is not the same language that they're speaking in. So the 117th Congress, which was the last Congress, only 18 members had a tech or science background, and if you throw doctors in there, you only get to 45. We haven't even hit 10% yet. Usually that's fine. Congress doesn't have to directly know every topic themselves. But when you look at staff, we have this same problem. Of 3,500 legislative staff in Congress, fewer than 20 have a tech background, and that's defined as someone who's got an academic degree in a technical field. That doesn't count the tech fellows that come from different nonprofits, including Tech Congress, from whom that stat comes. But even when we add those tech fellows in, there's only so many of them, and the demand right now is huge. So the people who typically would be offering these really deep backgrounds to guide legislation, we don't have those people here in Congress. And the pipeline isn't there either. The AI PhDs that are coming out are moving more into the private sector or staying in academia than they are going into government, which is understandable because it's kind of a thankless job without a lot of money involved. But that means that we're not going to see those numbers of people who have any kind of depth on AI moving into Congress anytime soon. Generally, this would not matter. Congress is made up of a body of very smart individuals who have smart individuals working for them. They've always been able to nimbly tackle any topic. But in my opinion, tech is a little different. You don't have that internal BS meter on things that move as quickly as AI and that are as highly technical as AI. So they end up falling back on some of these tropes that we see from pop culture. They end up relying on the anthropomorphization of technology a lot. They're treating AI as if it was human and then regulating it that way. And so these are problems. Talking about the executive trends, though, so let's first, before we talk about Congress, I'm going to zoom back out and talk about what's happening from the top. We've actually seen remarkable consistency on how executive orders have treated AI across three very dramatically different administrations. And I'm thinking there of the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. And then the most recent executive order on AI was in October, and this one really set the stage for how we plan to tackle the topic of governance. We saw that executive order pretty much come to the limit of what the president can do without Congress stepping in. Mostly it told essentially each agency, it said, AI touches all of your work, you need to do something about it. Calling for agencies both to implement AI, but also to start setting standards and regulations. Specific industries were given special emphasis, like housing, public health, criminal justice. The industries where we see AI having an outsized impact, potentially a negative impact, those agencies were told specifically to create more enforceable standards. And all of these things really kind of come back to NIST, which is within Commerce, but also kind of at this point operates by itself. NIST has always been a big part of how we approach tech governance. They developed, it stands for the National Institute for Standards and Technology. And NIST is wonderful, and they created a thing called the Risk Management Framework, which is a voluntary AI framework that a lot of companies have started using, and that forms the basis of a lot of our government conversations. But NIST is deeply under-resourced. They have very limited capacity, very limited money, and every time anybody does anything on AI, they get a new list of things they're in charge of. So it's a lot. This executive order, the deliverables from it are coming due already. Last week, there was a 90-day report on how things are going so far. Everything that was mandated in it has to be done by this October, and it's a lot of work. But again, there's a lot of gaps in this. The president can only do so much without Congress acting, and so Congress is trying to figure out where are those gaps that they can step in. The themes that we hear the most often on the Hill, a lot of these are going to be no surprise to you, and a lot of them have already come up. Number one is geopolitics. If I hear the word China one more time in the context of literally anything, I will die. But there's a lot of fears of falling behind. There's a lot of FOMO. They want to make sure that we're on top. America currently dominates AI research, but we need to keep it that way. And then we also see the chip war concepts coming back into play here, both directly in terms of how chips enable AI, who has the chips, who's making the chips, how many does China have, but also indirectly because those same themes that shape those conversations about global trade and about innovation are shaping how we talk about AI. We want to make sure that we're the ones creating the systems. We want to make sure we know what other systems exist, and we want to make sure that we can control it. And then the last point there is we want to make sure that the people who are the smartest on this technology are here, or are coming here, or are staying here. And so there's a lot of interesting immigration questions coming up. Second theme we hear a lot about is fostering innovation. I think this is a uniquely American fixation. We very much are anti-regulation because we want to make sure, to Ori's point, there's this concept that regulation crushes innovation. And so people are very reluctant to jump in because they want to make sure that American companies can be responsive and stay on top. And then again, that theme of retaining talent, keeping companies in the US, giving a favorable climate that makes sure that they're here. Third one, a lot of people are calling this the World Cup year of global elections. There's, I think, 53 elections around the world for executive level office, and a bunch more beyond that. So we're hearing a lot of people just hyper-focused in 2024 on those things. Dis and misinformation, the increase that we expect to see, the decreased barrier to creating it, and the fact that even people who are currently skeptical and usually pretty scam-proof, they're not ready for audio and video to be fakeable, and to be fakeable so easily. So we're seeing a lot of legislative movement around that because it's a catalyzing factor. It's time to act. And then again, and this Ori brought this up as well, the algorithmic systems that, beyond the generative, the algorithmic things can be used to isolate people, to thicken the walls and the bubbles between people who traditionally would have agreed about something, or to hyper-tailor political content. And then the last one is guardrails or human in the loop. We're seeing a lot of Congress people interested in doing narrow legislation that hyper-targets the riskiest or the most dangerous forms of AI as they perceive it. And maintaining a human finger on the metaphorical button or the actual button. There was a bill that wanted to outlaw the full automation of nuclear systems because if we launch a nuke, we should probably know that we did it and we chose to do it. Humans making key decisions is a thing that people talk about a lot in Congress. The themes we don't hear. And the surprise here on my slide is not glib. It actually is surprising to me that we're not seeing a lot of these things happen. There's no desire for sweeping legislation. There's no desire to create some brick of a system that's non-adaptable. The EU AI Act has really fueled this distaste. The EU AI Act is pretty much already out of date and we haven't even implemented it yet. So where normally we would see that Brussels effect where we saw with data privacy, they drive the conversation, it's actually leading us to pivot a different direction because we don't think it fills the needs of AI policy. So we're going to see a lot of people talking about specific use cases and specific outcomes that they want to tackle. This also, I think, is coming from it being more manageable to spin yourself up in a deep way on something that's hyper-specific. You can't become an AI expert overnight, but maybe you could figure out the deepfake thing enough to write a bill. Existential risk. For those of you who are not familiar, there are kind of three main camps of ideology within the AI field. Not important to get into the specifics on that, but the X-risk camp is the strongest, the oldest, and the most well-resourced. There was a Politico or Bloomberg article that talked about the fact that almost all of the tech talent that does advise Congress is funded by X-risk groups. And so there was some concern that there's been ideological capture on the Hill. There certainly is a lot of people talking about human extinction as a problem that we need to address, but you don't see those themes pop up in legislation itself. It's much more common sense, probably because we are doing these very narrow bills. You do see some biological warfare, nuclear warfare kinds of things. These are X-risk topics, but they're also national security topics that would have come up. And I don't know if we'll see that shift more toward the extinction becoming a bigger part of how we talk about legislation, but so far, no. And then finally, algorithmic justice. This obviously is something we've been discussing legislatively since well before the generative boom. And it's just simply too partisan to talk about it in this specific way. But the interesting thing is that with the advent of generative AI, suddenly we can talk about bias and discrimination again. It's made it much less partisan to address these things. So you'll see those topics be sewn into the executive orders, into legislative activity, and into other regulations. So let's talk about the major AI bills. And my grand caveat here is that literally this is only information that is current as of this exact moment. This moves so quickly, it's hard to always stay on top. And these are only going to be, we're going to talk about the bills that are from this specific Congress right now. So there are plenty that have been introduced in previous Congresses, but let's just look at what's in play right now. This is the big one. The AI Research, Innovation, and Accountability Act was introduced by Senator Thune with a bipartisan coalition behind him, including Senator Wicker of Mississippi. And this is the largest framework that we're probably going to see. First thing it does is specifies definitions for terms, which we framed our discussion by talking about what types of AI are we going to talk about. Congress hasn't done that yet, and so frequently people are talking past each other because we don't have any agreed upon definition of what a system is, what risk is, all these standards are missing. It also tries to break down some of those black boxes as much as possible. It tiers it into critical impact systems or systems where the decision being incorrect would have an outsized influence on rights and freedoms. And then with those, we see enforceable testing and evaluation systems. NIST is on the hook for those again. And then the high impact systems where, again, discrimination would be important but not quite as critical as the previous tier. We're going to try and have more transparency required for companies building those systems. And then NIST is back to do recs for sector-specific oversight for different agencies. And then the mis and disinformation shows up here too because it's 2024 and we're obsessed. NIST gets to create standards for authenticating online content. Platforms have to flag generative content, and we're trying to research more about verification. You'll see in a minute, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you'll see this obsession kind of with verification and authentication as combating the generation of false narratives, because that's all that they have really figured out so far in Congress. This concept of needing the red and the blue teams to be in play hasn't quite hit them yet. The Defiance Act, or the Taylor Swift bill, which is brought by the world's most interesting group of Senate co-sponsors, people who I did not think spoke to one another, it just kind of testifies to Taylor Swift's narrative power to be able to bring this group of people together. It seems on paper like it's not a big deal. All it does is create a civil remedy. So if you've been injured by non-consensual, sexually explicit deepfakes, you can sue someone now. But the acknowledgement of this in a piece of legislation kind of opens the door to get more done. If we can all agree that people are civilly liable for these kind of things, we can do more next. So it's also for people who are producing, distributing, or receiving. If you knew this was non-consensual material and you received it, you can be liable for this as well. So it's an interesting conversation there. More about disclosures, labeling, and authentication. Here's a bunch of other bills that are up here. And again, we're seeing really a fixation with watermarking, disclosures, labeling content. I think this is largely driven by the fact that we're coming out of the social media side of this debate around elections. We didn't really know how to fix it then. We still don't know how to fix it, but we're trying the same thing we tried before in hopes that it works. And we see this, industry is talking this way as well. OpenAI just put out a thing where metadata for generated images in DALL-E says that it's been generated, but there's a lot of ways you can strip that out. Literally just screenshot it and that metadata is gone. But people are thinking about this, and industry is responding to this approach that Congress has. Election-specific bills, same thing, but with politicians specifically. How can we keep politicians from being attacked or being manipulated around this? Bias and discrimination. Right now, we're talking more about research. They haven't really gotten to the point where they know what they want to do about it, but they know they want someone smart to do something about it, and they want the agencies that exist to be the ones that run that. Risk and national security. This is really more like a military and intelligence-driven kinds of things, but the one that I think is most interesting is the Test AI Act. Congress heard about test beds and they got super interested when people explained to them that the amount of compute required to test systems is hard to get if you aren't already associated with a company. They decided, oh, we should create more test beds. So here they are, and NIST has to do that again. Okay, so then the states showed up. Whenever Congress is slow to act, the states jump in, and this has really ticked up since the Trump administration. States are always the laboratory for the development or the deployment of systems, and for these questions actually hitting on the ground. What is happening when systems are deployed? And they want to fill the gaps in federal policy. So we're seeing a lot of people collaborate together, which is wonderful. There's a couple of different working groups, probably more than I am aware of, which is great. But the problem is that there's no centralized effort to help people to be a part of this. So we're seeing internal champions drive that. Like San Jose, California is unsurprisingly a leader in state regulation and use of AI. But if you don't have an internal champion, there really is no pathway for you to jump on. There's no help for you to get. We see a lot of bipartisan work here. There's an interesting alignment between parties and between states that have really nothing in common. What works in one place appears to work other places. A lot of people are pioneering solutions, but the problem is that we're developing a patchwork system. Just like we did with privacy legislation, we couldn't get it done at the federal level. A few states passed some, a few states passed another. We've created a system where it's very difficult for businesses to operate, and it's very difficult to say what rights a person has, their data, and we're doing it again with AI. So that's less than great. The states that are really out in front on this, unsurprisingly, California. They had a September executive order that focused on generative AI, but kind of decided to say, we're going to follow the RMF. We're going to do risk analysis of where we're exposed and new attack vectors that have opened up. And we're going to get government workers ready. We're going to train them on how to use AI. And then there's an act in the California Senate right now that would attempt to essentially say, well, if Congress isn't going to hold companies liable, we will. And here's what we're going to require them to do. Virginia is kind of on the same path. They are looking at hazards in key industries. They have standards that they actually implemented, which is interesting, and they budgeted for AI pilots for agencies, which is wonderful, because usually we just tell government, do this, but we don't actually give them any resources to do it. And then they've got some high-risk legislation. The definition of high risk is, again, different depending on who you ask. Vermont was early to the game. In 2018, they had a task force that was exploring the responsible use of AI, and so they were kind of ready for this boom. They had already created a commission and a code of ethics that was on paper, so they are in place to be able to really help inform the legislative conversation at the higher levels. And they are also looking at legislating high-risk AI. Last box over there just kind of shows you the number of people who are wanting to do stuff about this. This is an opportunity for politicians to kind of mint their name. So a lot of people who previously didn't really know what issue was going to be their legacy, they've chosen this one. So you see a lot of states that have, they're trying to research AI use, they're trying to put some privacy regulations on the books, which helps us do anything on AI. They're trying to combat bias, and specifically deepfakes and deception are coming up here a lot. All of this is good things, all of it is exciting things, but it's really unclear what kind of governance system we're building and how that fits in with other people. Industry has got a few different working groups that they're doing as well that I think they had hoped would help drive the conversation. But tech companies really have not bought themselves a lot of goodwill in DC, and there's a lot of skepticism and distrust. So we're not sure how much that's going to affect any legislation, but lots of interesting gaps and to look at in the future. My contact information is there, and I would love to talk with all of you more about how we can get Congress more ready to meet this moment legislatively, but I think we'll take some questions.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kellee.
I just wanted to add a comment on the underfunded nature of NIST. So I'm the executive director of For Humanity. We were just named one of the 200 groups in the US AI Safety Consortium. For that privilege, we had to pay $1,000. We're a nonprofit public charity, and we had to pay to offer our expertise into NIST. So
Well, thank you for your service.
This fed me. I ate. I love this. So thank you so much for all this information. This is super, super useful. I'm wondering if, I think understandably, Congress seems to be focusing on the content generation side of AI. Whether or not this is strictly within the purview of our conversation today, it's my personal bugaboo. Are there any conversations being had about the application of AI for infrastructures like transportation, like energy delivery, things like that?
Yeah, so that executive order that was in October hit a lot on infrastructure because there's a lot of concerns that China or Russia could attack us. The more we implement systems, the more that becomes a problem. So specific agencies were told, like, hey, figure this out and do it fast. But you're right. I think actually prior to ChatGPT coming out, we had a broader conversation about AI happening in Congress. It was just much lower profile and much less urgency. And it's almost like the conversations I used to have, I had to start out by talking about, what is AI? It's algorithmic it's recommenders, it's these things. And now you say, what's AI? And they're like, ChatGPT. And that's really the only definition that exists now for people, just because it is so high profile. So we're having to kind of shove back and say, okay, well, the stuff we were talking about, it's still there. We have to finish that conversation too. And it's, again, I think, back to that conversation about having a lack of depth in this technology. What is current is generative, and so that's all we talk about anymore. But in the agencies themselves around the government, there are people who are thinking about these things, thank God.
This is great, thank you. So it strikes me that a lot of at least the conversations we're having at the federal level with concerns about deepfakes, misinformation, disinformation, and attempts to regulate that strike me as somewhat feckless in the sense that we're concerned about foreign actors imposing those things internally. So are there efforts to kind of address, obviously I know a lot of this is dealt kind of in the intel community and whatnot, but are there efforts to address how to handle foreign actors that are introducing these sorts of technologies, or at least the byproducts of these technologies, into our country?
Yeah, I think, this again was a problem that predates generative AI that we hadn't figured out anything yet on. I think the hope is that the more we can figure out this authentication, verification, labeling, but also, literacy for individuals to become more skeptical as they're online, that would solve both the domestic and the foreign issues. That, really the core issue is what content reaches people and what capacity do they have to understand when it is fake. And the problem with that being the problem is the solution has to be multifaceted, and it's difficult to legislatively think about all the facets at once. So right now they're looking at just the technical side. What can we ask companies to do? What responsibility do social media platforms have to make sure that generated content is labeled as such? There's also some educational work going on. DHS actually has a few grant programs running called Targeted Violence and Terrorism projects, and part of that is disinformation coming from outside sources. How do we prep people? My program is building a game for middle school students to essentially pre-bunk, teach them how to identify disinformation and teach them that it exists at all. And really, I think everyone should play that game. But yeah, I think there's also a lot of things that industry can do outside of the verification and authentication things, but that's all Congress can handle right now, so we're doing that first. But I think the thought is that domestic and foreign, the problem is the same.
All right, so I saw Tim Holston back here.
My question is maybe simplistic. I think the pharmacy industry, FDA, provides a good outline of how we could handle regulatory bodies. Is there any talk you've heard about creating an agency like the FDA for technology, AI, outside of NIST, because you said they're underfunded?
Yeah, people have talked about that. There's the IAEA as a framework and the FDA as a framework. The feeling has been that, and I would actually personally tend to agree with this, creating another underfunded federal agency with a large remit is probably not the solution. And with the Biden administration's recent order, it seemed like they're moving in the direction of like, okay, if this touches literally every person's work, then every agency should be responsible for it. But the order did say essentially that there needed to be somebody in charge of AI policies within each agency and that they needed to work together. So I think that's going to be almost like an informal oversight agency, but people have talked about the FDA as a framework that would work for these. I think again, like the lack of desire for something overarching and sweeping is keeping people from wanting to create some kind of unifying body.
Hi, wonderful talk. Thanks. So my question is about where in the discussions about legislation is the buzz where humans and AI are working together to make decisions. I think in academia, where I'm doing research and hear a lot of buzz, the high stakes decision making is about jobs and hiring decisions. But the Civil Rights Act, right, there hasn't been any new legislation there. So I'm just curious, is that where the buzz is legislatively, or are they focused on something else?
Yeah, so they both, the executive order focused a lot on like employment, housing, public health, these things where we already had discrimination kind of popping out of systemic bias baked into systems that we had put in place. And so there is some direction to agencies like labor specifically was told to assess the risks of discrimination in employment and then to do something about it. And then the Thune bill that we talked about also, I think employment is one of the high impact systems that it would require transparency. Transparency is really hard in AI sometimes, but the idea is that people would know when a system is being used to make decisions. They would know what system and how it was created as much as possible, and there would be some kind of ability to appeal. I don't know if you've ever read the book Weapons of Math Destruction. Love the pun. But she always talks about how big data shouldn't be used to make a decision if there's no one you can appeal to if you think it was incorrect. And it seems like that is kind of a direction that they're going with that as well, is like human in the loop, but you should know when AI is impacting your life, essentially. I think the fact that the Thune bill includes those things is promising because Congress's eyes on. That bill was the product of a lot of other little bills that got proposed, dying and becoming this one because we think we can get it passed. I don't know if that answered your question, so.
I feel a little bit like a mouse seeking cheese in a maze with the chairs.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My question is, we've talked a lot about regulating these foundational models from OpenAI, from Anthropic, from Google, but Microsoft and the rest of the companies are kind of starting to do that themselves. What about open models that are on the market too? The Taylor Swift deepfake did not come from one of these proprietary models. It came from open models, right? I'm thinking also 24 hours before Biden's executive order, a company called Perplexity trained an open model too without any moral constraints whatsoever. In fact, you don't even need a login to use it. You just go to Perplexity AI, click on Playground, not telling you guys where to buy drugs, but that's where it's at. What sort of process would we even think about to deal with open foundational models, which seems to be kind of the tension here?
Yeah, that's a great question, I think. Congress and government kind of at large is allergic to open source in a way that actually kind of concerns me because I think open source is essential. So much of our infrastructure digitally depends on open source, but there's this perception that open means insecure, even though most of our security systems have open source pieces. And so when they do talk about open models, it's almost like well, how do we kill that, which is concerning. I think, maybe it was executive order, someone did a thing that instructed government to essentially research open models. And I think that's the first foray before they then decide what they're going to do about it. There's a lot of risks, but I think the risk of closing everything off and bottling up all these very momentous decisions in large corporations is is more risky. And I think it also would choke off a lot of the growth. You know, the open models are where we're going to get those narrow things that the market has no reason to develop a certain thing, but it's going to be what really moves the needle on AI, on scientific discovery, on all kinds of things. So right now, there's a distrust of open. No one is talking about what to do about it, but I think if you made them do a bill right now, it would kill it, which is horrifying.
So we have time for one more question over here.
So just a second ago, you were also talking about the human in the loop approaches. And one question that I have with that, and I might have missed this, I'm sorry, but when we're talking about complex neural networks, one of the biggest problems is the lack of explainability. And so even though ultimately there is a human making this decision, the model can't tell us on what grounds they made any recommendation or anything like that. Are there any bills that are grappling with that in detail about the issue of the lack of explainability and its impact on human in the loop?
They are certainly grappling with it as individuals, because they originally, the first thing that happened was they were like, well, we need to know how the systems work. Okay, well, you can't. If we knew that, it would be rules-based programming and we wouldn't be here. And so there was kind of a rejection of like, what do you mean we can't? What do you mean we don't know how they work? And people find that frightening, which always surprises me, because I guess, I don't know, you work with it long enough and you're like, yeah, we just don't know. It's empowering, I think. But so they're trying to understand that, and that's where I think education about having some kind of foundational understanding of how models are built, how they work, would be what gets us to a point where we can say, like, here's what explainability in AI means, and here's what it doesn't. Here's what we can't do. So I think we're not seeing that in bills because they're grappling with the fact that people are telling them that we can't. It's not feasible technically to do it. But I think they would love if they could force us to explain ourselves every time we do anything.
All right, thank you, Kellee.